Mark, and thanks everyone. Thanks for coming to listen. Thanks for the invitation from the AFR in Fairfax. If you look at this first video, at first glance here, you probably realize that these two guys are in the front seat of a moving car, and they're not in the middle seat of, say, a minivan. And you saw where they were looking there to be asleep, and I hope actually they weren't asleep because they're driving down the Atlanta freeway during the middle of rush hour at high speed. But you can see they did manage themselves to wake up and do checkers, Jenga, and go fish. And you don't have to search very far on YouTube to find drivers just like them trying out the autopilot software that Tesla has rolled out recently. And it's far limited to the Generation Y tech fanatics or nerds. And there's a very experienced driver there in the middle of the screen there who seems to be enamored with the technology as well. So it's something that clearly is out there. But you may be surprised to know that here we have the team at Fairfax, which is drive.com. And they've said they've managed another scoop and that they have done the first ever autonomous crossing of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So congratulations to Fairfax. But you people do know that this is completely illegal what he is doing. And the vehicle is even traveling in the lane, which is the reversible lane, so he's traveling with oncoming traffic on the right. So the combined speed would be somewhere around 140 kilometers an hour in this car. Now, I could expect my 19-year-old daughter to do something illegal and put it on YouTube, but you think, Fairfax, you might think about that before you do that next time. And watching this video and some of the things that we're going to talk about today, you might want to change that old slogan from "In God We Trust" to "In Software We Trust." Because Tesla's latest software update came with auto lane change, auto park, automatic emergency steering, side collision warning, as well as advice to the drivers to keep their hands on the wheels at all times. Now, that's definitely wise advice. But again, it's like taking a child into a toy store and saying, don't touch anything. Why would you provide this capability if you're not expecting people to use it? And if you can't resist touching, you'll not have to look far either, because there is a Sydney car rental company offering Teslas for hire and the potential for a trip from here to Canberra to be on autopilot for 95% of the way. And this is what the company says, quote, although you'll be in the driver's seat, you don't actually need to drive, meaning you'll arrive at the destination in Canberra refreshed and stress-free. Possibly not without a fine for breaking the law or a car accident, because I can assure you that the road is not certified between here and Canberra for autonomous operations. Now, there's more than 100 types of autonomous vehicles that are currently being tested legally on public roads, and the competition between tech and automotive companies is so fierce that in April, when Silicon Valley startup was granted the 13th license to test driverless cars on California roads, no one, except the company's founders, even knew about the company or was reported on, called Drive.ai. So we have Volkswagen, Mercedes, Ford, Google, Bosch, Tesla, and a bunch of other familiar names have already had approval to trial their vehicles in California. So whether we're ready or not, the technology is actually already here. The public's obviously on board. You saw the YouTube video, and that is exactly where the government, regulators, and road operators like ourselves need to be as well. Because this technology is not waiting for anyone or any regulation to catch up. And what we are seeing now is laying the foundation to an autonomous future on our transport networks, and will fundamentally change the way we move around our cities. This will have some wide-ranging implications, not just for roads, but for public transport as well, and how we integrate our movements around our cities. And we'll not only need the infrastructure that connects with these vehicles, but the regulatory frameworks, industry standards, and codes of practice to cater for the transition. And at the last count, and I think it was NTC or someone maybe in Mike's division that did the work, there are 716 pieces of Australian legislation and regulation that need updating, supposedly before autonomous cars can drive on our roads. Now, Andrew Constance, the New South Wales Transport Minister, was recently quoted as saying he didn't want to get dumped by the next wave of technology. He wanted to ride it. Well, I can tell you the wave's already arrived, and it looks big enough to block out the sun. And we'll all need to be on board, or we'll be swept away, because this wave is not going to be held back by outdated regulations and legislation. Now, this is particularly true of Australia because we will be the recipients of the world's manufactured cars, and we will have to adapt to their standards. And with all major manufacturers forecasting they will have a level of autonomous vehicle by 2020, not to mention the constant software upgrades provided over the internet with new capabilities every day. Now, to give you an idea of how this technology works and some of the range of sensors, cameras, and radar an autonomous vehicle uses to navigate the road, we've put together a 360-degree simulation of an autonomous vehicle traveling down CityLink in Melbourne. It shows how complex the interaction and connectivity between the vehicle and the surrounding roadside infrastructure will need to be to understand and respond to obstacles, speed, and lane usage. So this vehicle has entered CityLink from the Moreland Road on-ramp for those people who are from Melbourne. And it's obviously scanning the roadway, seeing the cars, the road pavement, the roadside barriers, the line marking, overhead bridges, and these have all been mapped in 3D. So autonomous vehicles, we use a combination of data, inputs from high precision 3D mapping, GPS, and LiDAR to navigate roadways. GPS alone, although even its most accurate, will not be enough to position vehicles, particularly in low visibility conditions such as fog and rain. Lane marking, while it seems very, very simple, is extremely important and is probably the easiest and first step that we need to make way for these vehicles. So you've seen here the cars classifying heavy vehicles as well as other cars. And when it goes through the tunnel in a second, you'll see it highlights the complexity of the information the car will have to deal with because instead of being able to clearly differentiate between the road and the sky, the vehicle is surrounded by structure. And it's important to remove as many obstacles as possible to keep these types of scenarios as safe as possible. We are now at the stage where navigation specialists, such as our technology partner in TomTom, are taking their maps to the next level of detail, like you've just seen. And these type of high-resolution 3D mapping will be critical for the safe deployment of autonomous vehicles. Now, once we take the humans out of the driving equation, the impacts will be far-reaching. For example, here's an intersection simulation with autonomous vehicles. There are no lights, there are no stop signs, there are no speed signs, just software creating the most efficient movements. And if you're a nervous passenger, you might want to block out your windows in the future. Did it stop? Did we have an accident? But the car manufacturing industry and other sectors such as insurance and trucking face major upheavals, but the opportunities are going to be tremendous in terms of road safety and efficiency. The number of crashes is forecast to plummet by 90% once autonomous cars reach critical mass on our roads, and that's not unrealistic given that human error causes 94% of vehicle crashes. It's estimated that up to 1 million lives could be saved every year globally with autonomous vehicles. Now, I was recently at a roads industry function where we heard that 40% of the children in the intensive care unit at one of the children's hospitals in Melbourne were there as a result of vehicle accidents. So this is truly frightening, and from a safety perspective, obviously this technology can't come safe enough. And while humans become more and more distracted with technology behind the wheel, and we've all seen the number of accidents have increased over the last couple of years in the major states, and a lot of that comes from distracted driving, and these were only increasing. We have the ability with autonomous cars on the other side to reduce those numbers. I think one of the quotes I read recently, which I like, is the only thing progressing faster than the pace of machine learning is the pace of human unlearning, unfortunately, when it comes to distracted driving. But so far, real-world testing has provided plenty of cause for optimism about the prospects of a safer future on our roads. So Google's cars have traveled more than 1.5 million miles and had been involved in 17 crashes, none caused by the car. Now, they did get up to, I think, 1.7 million, and there was a small crash that was caused by the car. So not completely flawless yet, but for large part, flawless performance so far. Virginia Tech Transportation, which we work with in the US, has compared the national crash rates to data from the Google program and showed a significant, as you'd expect, downward trend in crash rates and the severity of crashes in self-driving cars. And testing by the Chief Road Safety Authority in the US has shown that by just applying 2 numerous possible vehicle-to-vehicle safety applications, in this case an intersection movement assist and a left turn assist, 600,000 crashes could be prevented annually in the US alone. So besides the safety, they offer a huge potential to improve the efficiency of our roads. And with the next 20 years, we expect lane use capacity to increase by 10 to 25%, as these vehicles are introduced into the public. Lanes solely dedicated to autonomous vehicles could cater up to 4,000 vehicles per lane per hour, which is double the current theoretical throughput capacity of our roads. Now, unfortunately, we can't even reach the theoretical capacity of 2,000 lanes per vehicle per hour, mainly due to traffic incidents, vehicle breakdowns, and flow breakdowns, but this will also be mitigated by technology in the future as well. Now, the autonomous cars, they achieve this efficiency by what's using cooperative and adaptive cruise control, which we euphemistically call platooning. This allows them to travel closer together, slipstream style, using sensors and vehicle-to-vehicle communications to accelerate and brake simultaneously. Now, in April, the first truck platoons were trialed in Europe. 6 convoys of automated trucks traveled on public roads to Rotterdam from cities as far away as Stockholm, which is almost 1,500 kilometers. The trucks use a combination of radar, cameras, GPS, and vehicle-to-vehicle communication, and by taking advantage of the slipstream, we're able to achieve 10% savings in fuel, which is a great financial outcome as well as a good environmental outcome. The trial was an initiative of the European Union, which heralds it as the next generation mobility and freight, which is a greener and safer and more efficient way to beat congestion, which is predicted to rise by 50% by 2050 in Europe without intervention. And these advances are not simply the outcome of tech companies with big ideas and ambitions. I think we all know about the global trends such as the population growth and increasing urbanization, which had led to traffic congestion on unprecedented levels in many cities. At the same time, we're facing a worldwide backlog in infrastructure that the OECD estimates runs into the trillions of dollars. And our traditional funding source, which we'll talk about in this next panel, fuel excise, is rapidly diminishing as we move to fuel-efficient and electric cars. I can take one example here in Australia, where a well-known electric car company is marketing its cars to Uber drivers on the basis that they won't have to pay fuel tax. So how is it fair that an Uber driver doing 15 trips a day, an electric vehicle, pays the same amount in registration as a pensioner who does 15 trips a year? And when it comes to their contribution in fuel excise, the Uber driver with an electric vehicle pays nothing at all. So we need to find a better, smarter, and more efficient ways to move around our cities is critical, and that will not only involve this technology, but reforming the way we fund the transport system that is based on, we believe, user pays, and just like other utilities, where the consumer pays for what they use, but always, and very importantly, an overlay of fairness and equity. Now today, just over half of the world's population lives in urban areas, and that's expected to increase to 66% by 2050 as employment continues to concentrate in the cities. And for many, and particularly young people, a car is a very expensive burden. Now, I think the next slide you can see here, there's a noticeable decline in the number of licenses as millennials move away from car ownership. Victoria actually has seen the most significant drop, with the number of license holders aged under 25 falling by more than 10% in less than a decade. Now, instead, these millennials and the young people want easy and efficient ways to move around our cities without the burden of high capital cost of car ownership. So a term that we've seen, and we're going to hear a lot more, and it's going to be probably as big as the technology, is mobility as a service. And it describes the shift toward providing consumers with individual targeted travel options through a one-stop shop. Most of that is in the form of a smartphone interface, a smartphone application. These service providers are packaging up transport options with real-time route information and online payment. Consumers select their route based on preference of time, cost, and lifestyle, with options such as bike, train, or car share. These providers take a holistic view of the transport offering, combining public transport and car travel options. Integrating modes of transport will be critical in addressing these global challenges we face to provide effective transport solutions. And to get the best out of our transport networks, consumers will need real choice and options. Now, this generational shift in car ownership is also giving rise to alternative forms of transport, such as car sharing and carpooling schemes. As young people will not only be the only beneficiaries, there are many, many others, including older people and people with disabilities, which will have access to new mobility options through connected, automated, and shared transport systems. So one of the other, I guess, alternatives or outcomes of this future is we believe there'll be a lot more kilometers traveled, but just a lot more efficiently. The City of Sydney's car and share scheme has grown fourfold since 2011, and about 20% of the city households of Sydney are now members, but we're talking about the city of Sydney here in the center. Car manufacturers such as Mercedes and BMW are also responding and branching out from their traditional business models to launch their own car-sharing schemes. Uber has introduced a ride-sharing service, which I think we're all familiar about, Uber Pool here, also in China. And in China alone, there are 20 million Uber Pool trips every month. Apple is also taking on the Chinese market and invested $1.4 billion in a ride-hailing service called Didia, while the race is on to capture the ride-sharing market in India, which has a car ownership of 20 cars per 1,000 people. Uber has poured in more than $1 billion to take on the rival Ola, which has raised $1.4 billion for the ride-sharing economy. And earlier this year, General Motors became the first major car manufacturer to invest in a ride-hailing service, and they put $500 million into Lyft, which is Uber's major American competitor. Now, these two companies have said that their partnership is based on their view that self-driving cars will reach consumers first as part of this mobility or ride-sharing service, rather than vehicles being owned individually by drivers. They expect to start testing a fleet of self-driving taxis within 1 year. And the GM president, Don Armand, has said he expects business and personal mobility to change more in the next 5 years than it has in the last 50 years. I know that sounds incredible, but when you see the speed of change that's happening across this whole sector, with the cost of batteries coming down, with the cost of autonomous vehicles coming down and the infrastructure that's needed, it would be a brave person to say that he's wrong. And for all of us in the transport and infrastructure sector, the message is clear. Disruption and opportunities are not 5 or 10 years or 20 years away. They are actually happening now, but they've actually been happening for some period of time. For us, just 17 years ago, CityLink opened in Melbourne, and its fully automated tolling system was hailed as one of the most technologically advanced roads in the world. Now today, when you drive on the road, it may look more or less the same to the average driver, but the technology underpinning the infrastructure has been constantly developed and expanded to optimize traffic flow and create a better and safer experience for drivers. We've introduced coordinated ramp metering, a lane use management system, variable speed limit signs, CCT, cameras, and travel time information. Now, it may not sound much, but these systems have seen the average speeds at peak times increase by 40% over the alternative, and have allowed nearly 20% more cars to travel on each lane, which is equivalent to adding more than half a lane to the motorway through technology alone. We now have automated incident detection systems, which have allowed us to improve the time it takes to clear an incident by more than 30%, and we're also using data analytics to help predict and prevent accidents. We ran a proof of concept last year, and we've shown that by using data from our traffic and control systems, as well as other sources including weather information, we're able to predict the likelihood of an accident 30 minutes ahead of it actually happening with a 90% level of accuracy. Now, interesting, the highest risk time for crashing on our roads is not peak hour or when visibility is poor, but on Sundays when traffic levels are at lower levels, but speed is high and people are distracted. We're now applying this information to real-world traffic management practices and the proactive use of our real-time messaging to try and ensure drivers stay alert. And just as important as the in-vehicle technology development is the advancement of the technology in the infrastructure. Our networks in Australia and the US have more than 500 kilometers of optic fibers. I think we had more fiber than NBN at one time, and which is connected now to over 100,000 pieces of technology and safety systems. So we need smart infrastructure to support smart vehicles. In the US, our express lanes are being used to test automated vehicles, and you'll notice that he actually keeps his hand on the wheel, even though it's an automated vehicle, but it is controlled conditions, without significant obstacles, hazards, or crossings. They also have very high quality surface conditions, lane markings, and infrastructure connectivity that supports the trials and the introductions of self-driving vehicles. We partner there with Virginia Tech and the Virginian government and give automotive companies the ideal real-world environments they need to test complex scenarios before putting their vehicles on the public roadways. Now, all these developments we are seeing today are critical to helping create a more efficient and safer experience, and they're among the building blocks we'll need to pave the way for the driverless future. The next level of development will see connectivity improve between infrastructure and vehicles. And despite the exploits of drivers that we saw earlier on YouTube, there's still a lot of conjecture about the pace and change and adoption. Many in the industry are confident that we are 5 to 10 years away from autonomous vehicles being on the market with mass adoption likely by 2040. So this chart on the screen shows the timing and level of automation predicted by the US National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. We think it's probably conservative. So levels 1 and 2 of automation, which includes features such as automatic braking and adaptive cruise control, where the car paces itself with the car ahead, are already common in many vehicles. And as you see, many of the cars will skip what's called level 3 of limited self-driving automation to level 4, which is fully self-driving automation. And they're saying mass adoption or saturation by 2040. And while there's certain to be some who'll still want to drive, I think there will come a time when owning a driverless car will be the obvious and only choice. It'll be interesting when you have to make a decision between driving a car and risking your family's safety, if you could own an autonomous vehicle and keep them safe, or you want to manually drive and risk their safety. But the timing will depend, as we said earlier, on negotiating legislative changes, regulations, liability, privacy, and security protection to make way for the technology. Now, auto companies are already starting to head the issue off over liability to ensure it doesn't stand in the way of progress. Volvo recently announced that it would accept full liability from whenever one of its cars was in autonomous mode had a crash. And the suite of rules and regulations must consider the transition phase when both manual and automated cars are on the road, and developing systems to ensure the roads can be shared safely will be critical. One possible approach may be the introduction of dedicated lanes for suitably equipped vehicles. Now, in the US, the federal government has pledged to expedite regulatory guidelines for autonomous vehicles, and they've committed $4 billion in research to bring these to market. And lobby groups have also called for the introduction of sweeping federal legislation to avoid a patchwork of state rules they believe could slow down the adoption of vehicles. And in Australia, I think it was just last month or the month before, the National Transport Commission outlined a number of these barriers and has started the process to provide recommendations for a nationally consistent regulatory framework. Now, NTC recognizes the potential for automated vehicles to fundamentally change the transportation landscape with benefits in safety, access to mobility, productivity, and the environment. But it also acknowledges the driverless car will pose the biggest change to our transport system since cars replaced horses. There's a couple of photos, I don't know if people have seen, of New York. It's one of my favorite photos, where it shows at the early turn of the century, where there's a picture of a New York street where there's one car and the rest of it's full of horses, and 13 years later there's one horse and the rest of it is full of cars. So if you think you can replace the horse in 13 years, how fast do you think technology today can replace current manually driven cars? Now, South Australia is already legislating for controlled testing of driverless cars, and trials planned for other states. This framework from the NTC is actually critical. So for us, it's a very challenging time trying to keep up with the technology and some of the things people are doing on our roads, as you would see. But we must remember that technology in itself will not be enough to bring about the transformational reform. Because as technology changes transport, we'll need to reform the way we pay for our roads to provide a fair and sustainable system, again, that's built on a principle of those who benefit pay. Again, we're talking about an electric future here, largely with these vehicles. This will also allow us to invest in the infrastructure more efficiently and also spend the money we need to upgrade the roads for the technology. Ultimately, it'll be up to governments and the industry to be responsive to harness the technology offerings that we think promise so much. And in the age of what the consumer-driven demands and when benefits are so tremendous and obvious, we must be very agile or we will lose control of what's happening in our transport system. Because as we said earlier, the technology wave is advancing and we need to be on board to reap the benefits, because it won't be long before you see a guy like this driving alongside you and you'll be very happy an intelligent car is driving and not the human. Thank you. Do you have the video?
Check this out. This guy passing me, I'm going to be like, no hands.
It's a scary future. Happy to take some questions. Thank you.
I know you're about to join a panel, and there's probably a couple of questions from the floor. I might just get in first, though. I know you talked a lot about the inevitability of driverless cars coming, and you're saying, I think it was mass adoption by 2040. How is it going to affect Transurban's business model, and how are you guys going to make money out of this? I know you've been, I know you've been reported previously about how it could be you may need a separate lane for driverless cars. How does that fit in with the existing infrastructure? Does just mean that the manual drivers are going to be stuck in gridlock while the driverless cars go flying past? How's it going to work in practice?
Well, I guess from Transurban's perspective, I think with any new technology, you can't put your head in the sand and then hope it goes away. We've seen what happens to companies in the past that do that. So I guess we're trying to embrace and see what we can do to affect the future. I think what I said is we see most of these things, pluses and minuses to the amount of kilometers being driven. Mobility as a service probably means less kilometers, but then it opens up whole new areas for people to travel. So we think in the future there'll actually be more kilometers traveled, which is good for roads, but a lot more efficient. And so what we're trying to do is, I guess, make sure we have the infrastructure in place to allow that to happen and to happen safely. I think what we could see is like what we saw in the US, where we have our express lanes there, that they're perfect for autonomous vehicles because they're separated for the rest of the lanes. So I think in the future you might have the fast running lanes where you could say, if you have a autonomous capable vehicle to move in that lane, and yes, you will have a better service, but you've got a better vehicle that's much safer and capable of doing a whole lot more. But that is something I think where the industry's got to come together. The biggest issue for us is it's happening now. So those autonomous vehicles are driving across the Harbour Bridge every day now. People are doing stuff that the roads aren't prepared for. You know, they're doing things now, and we need to just at least trial some things to see how we can address it. But happy to do that on our roads. But again, we think more kilometres will be driven in the future because mobility will be so much more efficient.
Okay, we've got a question from, I think we've got a question from down the front here.
Scott, Martin Hazy, Lord Mayor, City of Adelaide. Thank you, that was an outstanding presentation. From a city's perspective, what is the first piece of infrastructure that cities need to start rolling out? Is it sensory technology, or what is the first part of this puzzle that cities need to start laying out to accommodate the inevitability of driverless vehicles?
Yeah, well, the sensors are a big part of it, and whether you use sensors or cameras, are all pretty cheap now and easy to use. I mean, one of the interesting things is we already have so much data. I mean, the amount of data that we have from our roads, or RMS would have, or Vic Roads would have, I'm sure you have in Adelaide, but we don't use the data yet. So we've got a data analytics team and using big data to try and gather what we have now. As I said, we've already run a proof of concept, even with the data that we have now, where we can predict incidents. But certainly starting to put the technology for us on roads, and look, our company is in the road business, but we're very much integrated with public transport. We don't see this as a roads future. It's a very much integrated future where people can choose bike, car sharing, and it becomes efficient now to use integrated modes as opposed to the past where you wouldn't. I think, though, for the roads, we keep building out the roads, but as I said, some of the stuff that we've been doing on the technology side to use the roads more efficiently we have, some of that starts with a lot of sensors, cameras, and other things just to maximize the current assets.